husband wants me to kick my dying son out of the house and called him a burden, but he discovered that my son owns half of it. When my son Nate got diagnosed with leukemia at 24, he had to move back home for treatment. My husband Carl immediately started complaining. He's an adult. He should figure this out himself. I didn't sign up to live with your grown kid. The house belonged to me from my late husband, but Carl acted like Nate was invading his personal space. This was supposed to be our fresh start together, not a nursing home for your son. Carl would do these passive-aggressive things to make Nate feel unwelcome. He'd cook dinner for just the two of us and tell Nate there wasn't enough food. When Nate was too weak from chemo to make himself something, Carl would say, "Your mother isn't your servant. You have working hands." He'd blast music at 6 in the morning, knowing Nate was nauseated and needed rest. When I asked him to keep it down, he'd say, "I'm not changing my routine because your adult son can't handle real life." The worst was when Nate had treatments. Carl would complain about having to see medical equipment in his house. He'd make gagging noises when Nate threw up from the chemo. This is disgusting. Can't he do that somewhere else? He'd spray air freshener directly at Nate and say the sick smell was ruining his appetite. When Nate lost his hair, Carl bought him a hat that said freeloader and left it on his bed. "Just a joke," he said when I confronted him. "Someone needs to keep spirits up around here." Carl started trying to charge Nate rent. He's living here for free. That's not teaching him anything about responsibility. When I reminded him that Nate couldn't work because he was fighting cancer, Carl said, "Plenty of sick people still contribute. He's just using his illness as an excuse to be lazy." He'd leave printouts of apartment listings on Nate's bed. Circle Help wanted ads and tape them to his door. Tell him about friends whose kids were successful and independent. Tommy's son just bought his own house. But I guess some kids are raised to be achievers and others are raised to expect handouts. One day, Nate's white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, and he had to be extra careful about germs. Carl deliberately invited his poker buddies over. 6 guys smoking cigars and coughing everywhere. When I begged him to cancel, he said, "This is my house too. I'm not going to stop living because your son has a weak immune system." Nate ended up in the hospital with an infection that almost killed him. While Nate was in the ICU, Carl told me this was a sign. Maybe it's time to look into long-term care facilities. This isn't working for anyone. He actually brought me brochures for nursing homes. They have trained professionals. It would be better for everyone. That's when I remembered something important. The house wasn't just from my late husband. It was specifically willed to me and Nate. Carl had no legal claim to it at all. I'd never put him on the deed because my late husband wanted to make sure his son always had a home. I called my brother-in-law, who was a real estate attorney, asked him to pull all the paperwork. Sure enough, Nate legally owned half the house. Carl was basically just a guest who happened to be married to me. When Nate got out of the hospital, Carl was waiting with more apartment listings. I found some places with disability access. You could probably afford them with government assistance. That's when I told him to pack his things. Carl laughed. "You're kicking me out, your husband, over your freeloading son?" I showed him the deed. "This house belongs to me and Nate. You don't own anything here. You're the one freeloading, and now you're leaving." Carl's face went red. "You can't be serious. I'm your husband. I have rights." My brother-in-law walked in right then with eviction papers. "Actually, you don't. You're not on the deed. You have no rental agreement. You're here at the homeowner's discretion, and both homeowners want you gone." Carl tried everything. He cried about how he'd paid for groceries sometimes, how he'd fixed the garage door once, how he'd invested emotionally in making this his home. "I gave up my apartment for this. Where am I supposed to go?" Nate spoke up for the first time in months. Full story on channel, link below.